right, so unsecured networks. We're going to start by talking over Wi-Fi and wireless networks, and we're going to compare this to wired networks. So when we're just talking about networks in general, typically in our enterprise, and what we have to worry about in cybersecurity as just a general network is going to be your wireless and your wired network on the enterprise, okay? Now this is going to be like on-prem. So description, a Wi-Fi network is a wireless network that uses radio waves to provide network connectivity. So some of the risks that are going to be involved when we're looking at securing our wireless networks are going to be man-in-the-middle attacks, some network sniffing or wireless sniffing, unauthorized access, and also Wi-Fi spoofing. So some of these risks when it comes to like Wi-Fi spoofing, they're going to talk about certain attacks like evil twin attacks. So this is where you have, let's say, the good SSID. So we'll say the good SSID or the legit access point will be, let's say, Trepa Wi-Fi. And then we have the evil SSID or access point. That's also Trepa Wi-Fi. Except now we made the signal stronger on that access point closer to our users. Or maybe we put it in the parking lot. So now these BYOD or mobile fleet of devices we have automatically connect to them. And then that evil twin access point can do something like packet captures, right? So that's kind of a Wi-Fi spoofing attack. You also have stuff like disassociation attacks where you can send 802.11 frames that force a computer to disassociate from a broadcasting SSID. Different types of attacks like that. So some of the mitigations we can have when it comes to data being stolen from something like network sniffing or those Wi-Fi spoofing attacks is always to have strong encryption. Now, this is going to protect us from people actually stealing our Wi-Fi network, right? Not actually gaining access, not having that open Wi-Fi signal, right? So we have strong encryption we can use like WPA3. We can implement strong passwords for a pre-shared key at Wi-Fi. So, you know, with the different types of WPA, so whether you're WPA2/3, we have WPA2/3 personal, and we have enterprise. So if we're doing personal mode, especially if WPA2, we want to have strong passwords. Now, this isn't necessarily going to protect us if someone's doing a packet capture and they capture that, right? With WPA3, what's good is that it provides something called SAE, that's simultaneous authentication to equals. That's going to give us protection against brute force attacks by doing just the way it encrypts for PSK, right? And not get too deep into it, right? Because there's going to be a Wi-Fi section coming up. And then it also gives us PFS, that's perfect forward secrecy, in case that one of the keys gets stolen, then the next time it gets encrypted, the next session of encryption, that old key can't be used. That's perfect forward secrecy. And then, of course, we want to employ network segmentation. So maybe we do just want to give a guest Wi-Fi SSID for people to connect to and then really lock down our enterprise network, okay? Down here, I have the different types of authentication that we can do in an enterprise environment. Where open authentication just means there's no protection, no authentication required. And then we have some advanced authentication like the Extensible Authentication Protocol, which is just a framework, and TLS built on top of that, okay? So a way that we can do advanced or more secure authentication on our wireless networks. Okay, then we have wired networks. So an unsecured wired network refers to a physical Ethernet-based network that could potentially lack proper security measures. So we're talking an unsecured wired network, such as no authentication protocols, no data in transit encryption, and no NAC or network access controls. So while wired networks are generally considered more secure than wireless ones, just due to the physical nature, right? To actually get a wiretap, you'd have to physically tap that wire instead of just sniffing Wi-Fi, right? They can still be vulnerable to various security threats if not properly secured. So a big one is like, let's say you have bad physical access control. Someone can come in, plug into your wall jack, and if you have no port security on that wall jack or no network access control, or if it's just left wide open in the default native VLAN, you're opening yourself up to be very vulnerable. So some characteristics of unsecured wired networks. So an unsecured wired network will lack encryption. So data transmitted over unsecured wired networks, if it's not encrypted, it's going to be susceptible to interception and eavesdropping and man-in-the-middle attacks. If we have no authentication, so if we don't have any network access control, if we don't have a AAA server that's doing TACX or radius or .1x, right? We could easily have people get access that should not be authorized. If we have bad physical access control, so if network cables, switches, or routers are not secured, if our data closet is not secured, someone can come in there and just, do a simple denial of service attack, power it off. And then maybe we didn't save our network configs, and, that could be a big problem. Or maybe they put a wiretap on there that we're not aware of because it's going to be in promiscuous mode. You won't notice it. Okay, so that's going to be it. So mitigation for wired networks, you're always going to want to have port security. You're going to want to use network access control, things like AAA. So doing protocols like .1x to authenticate devices, maybe doing some client-based, right? Making sure you have TACX and radius for our network authentication, for our network infrastructure. Making sure we have some simple port security. Making sure we're also doing network segmentation. Another thing we can do, if we kind of have like an open campus where people have good physical access control, like we don't have points of entries that are secure, something of that nature, one thing that we can do is implement something called a black hole VLAN on our switch ports, which is a VLAN that pretty much leads to nowhere, doesn't lead to any subnet that's going to give you network access. Or we can make sure that if a port's not being used, it's not plugged into the patch cable, there's no user connected to it, that it's just turned off to make sure that our physical ports are turned off. Okay, that's another way we can secure our wired networks. Another network you have to be aware of is Bluetooth. Bluetooth in our enterprise, right? So it's a convenient technology that allows phones to connect to like peripherals, like, headphones. It allows keyboards to connect to your computers, mice to connect to the computers. But there are some risks. So blue snarfing is a risk. That's where there's going to be theft of information via Bluetooth. We have blue bugging, which is taking control of a device via Bluetooth. So some characteristics of unsecured Bluetooth networks. So they're going to lack encryption. So Bluetooth communication is typically unencrypted, which allows somebody or a malicious attacker to eavesdrop on the data transmissions if we're doing data transmission over Bluetooth. So like you can do like Bluetooth hotspot, right? So you can network bridge via Bluetooth, and then that is just maybe unprotected and left wide open. Someone could be eavesdropping. No authentication. So the absence of strong authentication methods can let unauthorized devices connect and communicate over Bluetooth. It's very vulnerable to eavesdropping or sniffing, okay? And then Bluetooth discoverable mode. So if devices are constantly sending out that Bluetooth like broadcast, that's going to lead them open to attack. It's going to be a big vector, okay? All right. Moving on. Open services or ports. So open service ports in the context of cybersecurity refer to network ports on a computer or server that are accessible and can potentially accept incoming connections or data. These ports serve as communication endpoints for different types of services and applications running on our network device. So sometimes these open ports will be necessary for communication and functionality. Sometimes they're not, and they may just be default ports that now just leave us more open to attacks. So let's go and understand these open service ports. So the function of service ports. These are network ports that allow computers and servers to communicate with each other over a network. Stuff like HTTP on port 80, HTTPS on port 443, or SSH on port 22. So ports are identified by their numbers ranging from 0, let me write this out for you guys, from 0 to 65,535, that's the range. So the standard service ports that are typically well known that could potentially be attacked are going to be 0 through 1023. So the state of ports. So a port can be in different states such as open, closed, or filtered. Meaning if it's wide open, it's going to accept any connection, right? If a port's open on a server, any client device connecting to that server via that port's going to allow it. We have a closed state, which means it's not accepting that connection, but maybe the technology or the protocol associated with that port may be enabled, but it's closed. And then we have a filtered state, meaning that it's not reachable typically by some sort of access control list or firewall. So what is the impact on our cybersecurity when we have these open ports? So open ports can be exploited as entry points into a system or network. So attackers can scan for these open ports and easily identify them and have that potential vulnerability exploited. Unsecured services. So services running on open ports might have vulnerabilities or may not be securely configured, leading to a higher risk of cyber attacks. Of course, data breaches. So when we get that unauthorized access to those open ports, it can lead to the exfiltration of data and have those data breaches. Malware infections. So open ports can be used to deliver malware to a system. So maybe we're not exploiting that port in itself, in its own, doing a data breach, but we're using it as a way to get in, to backdoor, and now deploy a malicious payload. Denial of service attacks. So attackers may target open ports with excessive requests, leading to a DDoS or distributed denial of service attack. So essentially what we're saying here is, yeah, the port's open. Maybe they're not using that to backdoor and exploit us with malware, but maybe they just keep attacking that port and it's overloading our CPU, and now we're denied service to our actual customers or users. So some mitigation. We can do port scanning and auditing on our systems ourselves to make sure we don't have any open ports. And then from there, we're going to close those unnecessary ports we don't need open. We want to make sure that we have some firewalls configured, whether that be host-based or inline. We want to make sure that we're doing good patch management, ensuring we have good secure configurations as part of our enterprise standard. Also, network segmentation, making sure that if we have a system that is going to need these open vulnerable ports, that maybe we segment it from the network. And then, of course, we want to have some good monitoring and logging on our network traffic that's getting good alerts to us in case we see maybe some deviated behavior over a port, right? That kind of can help us prevent that DDoS attack. If we notice a lot of incoming connections on a port that we don't usually see, maybe that means an attacker scanned us and now they want to exploit that. Okay, default credentials. So default credentials on our services. So what we're saying here is that maybe we have Windows machines. Maybe we have IoT devices that have weak default credentials that we want to not have enabled. A perfect example that's going to be the local admin on our computers. So you see here this default account. It looks like it's disabled right here, but if it wasn't, that could be something that an attacker potentially could exploit. Sometimes default credentials, like on your home Wi-Fi routers, there's whole spreadsheets dedicated to knowing the default admin and passwords for some of these very basic Wi-Fi access points that are in SOHO networks, small office, home office, right? So default credentials give you an ease of access to attackers, and the impact on security could be that if something like an admin account is left at default, well, now they have elevated privileges to do any sort of attack they want if they get access to that default credential. So supply chain attacks. So right now we're going to go over how MSPs, managed service providers, could potentially be a vulnerability. So MSPs, what they do is they manage IT services for a bunch of different small to medium-sized companies, or they're a part of a large company's IT infrastructure, right? Maybe they have their own IT department. They offload some things to MSPs, right? So potential security risks posed by MSPs to you. So in this example, we're part of a cybersecurity team at an enterprise, and maybe we use an MSP. How do we interpret that, right? How do we as a cybersecurity professional make sure that we're vetting our MSPs correctly? And how can we write up to management saying, hey, these are potential risks that could happen when we use an MSP and don't invest in our own people, right? So, potential risk. MSPs can have access to sensitive information and they're not part of your organization, right? Dependencies on MSP security practices. So if we're dependent on an MSP and let's say they go under, or all of a sudden we can't use them anymore, that's a dependency we don't want. They can potentially be a single point of failure. So using a single MSP can create a single point of failure, especially for our infrastructure. So if we're relying on MSPs for all of our infrastructure, let's say they raise prices, or again, let's say they go out of business, or let's say they have some rogue users, or they have their main network engineer quit, or their main system engineer quit. That's a failure on us as a business, because now we're worried not just about us not being secure, because maybe they're doing security for us, but now we're worried about that logic lost, right? Now we're worried about, well, who's going to support our users, and can they do it effectively, and are we wasting money on this MSP? They could have some insider threats at the MSP that we cannot identify because we're not working for or with that company directly. They're doing our services, but they're still a third party. Compliance and legal risk. So if your MSP does not know how or does not comply with industry standards or legal regulations, that could still be on you. So if you're having them handle your HIPAA and making sure that you're secure, then that could be an issue, right? Because you would still be at fault if that was violated, okay? So how do we mitigate those risks? You just got to do proper vetting. Make sure that maybe you're getting another third party to do security audits on that MSP and their services. Ensure you have contractual clarity. Make sure you understand completely what that MSP is providing and make sure you know how to audit them if they're not providing that service correctly or in a timely manner, okay? And then, of course, we have vendors. So in the supply chain attacks as well, we have to worry about the vendors we use when we're ordering hardware. So potentially we could have hardware suppliers that could be compromised, right? And that could be somewhere in their supply chain. So we have to worry about third-party breaches, software supply chain attacks. For an example, like SolarWinds, that was a major vendor for the DoD for all network monitoring, and they got exploited by an attack, okay? So sometimes it's the vendor that we're working with that could be a risk to us. And then, of course, dependency. So over-reliance on a single vendor or lack of redundancy can lead to significant operational risk if the vendor faces downtime or, again, goes out of business. So a lot of times this comes up when we're working with maybe a startup company, right? Or someone new that's providing a new SaaS for us, a new software as a service. If they're new, we have to worry about their longevity, right? All right, awesome, guys. Now let's go ahead and do a check on learning. We're going to go do our practice exam questions for this section. All right, question 1. So we're going over unsecure networks, open ports, default credentials, and supply chain attacks. And this is going to be our practice exam software that all of our students get when they purchase our self-paced or live virtual training. There's over 1,000 practice exam questions for you guys on this new SY0-701 once it launches fully on our site. So let's go ahead and use our custom practice exam software to do some check on learnings. So question 1, why are open service ports considered a significant security risk? So we're going to go with B. They can be exploited by attackers to gain unauthorized access. Awesome. That's the correct answer. We also see our explanation down here, which we get with all of our questions. Question 2. What makes Bluetooth connections a potential security risk? High energy consumption? I don't think so. Slow data transfer rates? Definitely they can do slow data transfer rates, but I don't know if that's a potential security risk necessarily. Potential for unauthorized device pairing and data interception. So I'm going to go with C. B is a good answer, as in, yeah, it is short-range wireless communications. That is what Bluetooth is, but not necessarily that's a dedicated security risk. So I'm going to go with C. Question 3. What makes wireless networks a common threat vector compared to wired networks? Higher data transfer speeds? That's not true. Wi-Fi 6 is nowhere compared to 10 gigabit Ethernet, right? Physical security measures? Potentially, right? But that's more our concern with wired networks, right? When people can come in and plug into one of our ports. B, the signal encryption methods, possibly. But really it's going to be C, the broadcast nature of wireless signals. That's how it compares to wired networks, right? Is that it's broadcasted via radio signals that are open. Question 4. Why are default credentials considered a security vulnerability? It's not that they're difficult to remember. They can be very easy. They are required for initial device setup. Potentially, they are used for that, but is that a security vulnerability? They indicate strong user authentication. That's a definite no. So between B and D, I'm going to go with B. They're often publicly known and easily guessable, and that is true because when you come out with a product with a default credential, if you're selling millions of products, they're not just going to all come off the line. They're not just all going to come off the line with different credentials, right? It's just not going to happen. All right, question 5. How does the supply chain represent a potential threat vector? By increasing operational costs? I mean, that could potentially happen. B, by introducing vulnerabilities through third-party components. C, by slowing down product delivery. Or D, by enhancing product quality. So definitely going to be B. C could happen, D could happen, A could happen, but again, not an actual part of our threat vector, okay? So we're going to go with B. view our results, and we got 100%. All right, guys.